22 years ago, I walked into the offices of the Nova Scotia Barrister Society as a first-year law student and began working there in the summer. I worked for 2 summers, and ever since then, in one way or another, I've worked with or become part of the work of the Nova Scotia Barrister Society. I remember when I walked in and Darryl was relatively new and Victoria Reese was relatively new, and I thought to myself, what in the world have I gotten myself into? 22 years later, I stand before you and say to myself, what in the world have I gotten myself into? However, what I can tell you is that your regulator, your society, has worked extremely hard over those 22 years and will continue to work extremely hard to serve the public interest in the practice of law and to make sure that all of us are well served by our regulator. Dan has talked about a number of things that occurred over the last year and has alluded to and mentioned many of the things that we're going to do this year and beyond. It's a full agenda. And it's been a pleasure to work with the council that we have. One of the good changes that we've made over the last couple of years is that we now extend the term of council to 2 years so that we have a good amount of continuity. Our committees are about 2 years in length, and we have a smaller, more nimble council to deal with issues as they arise. So I think that has been a great improvement. I do want to acknowledge that we have a new member of our executive this year, and we have our existing executive. I'll act as president. René Gallant, who's here in the front row, will be the first vice president as of today. And Tilly Pillay from the Department of Justice, who many of you know, will come in as our second vice president effective today. So I'd like to welcome Tilly to the executive and to Bar Council. I also want to let you know that for those of you who haven't seen the committee lists that have come out in just the last couple of days, that one of the perks of being president is that you get to choose somebody to be the honorary president of the society. And without any hesitation, when I found out that I could do so, I thought of the one person that I would want to ask, David Wallace of McIntosh, MacDonald & MacDonald in Glasgow. And David has kindly agreed to serve, though he couldn't be bothered to show up today. I'll have a little chat with him about that, right, Bruce? For those of you who know David, you can well understand why he would be my choice, and I began with that firm 20 years ago as an article clerk. I continue a close association with them, though I don't practice with them, and I look to all of them, particularly the senior partners, for guidance throughout my career. I do want to acknowledge as well there are a number of presidents, past presidents, that I just want to mention. Not all of them are those dating well back, but there are some that in recent times have had a great impact on how I intend to conduct myself as president this year. And some of them are here today. I don't intend to have them stand or be embarrassed, though I'm sure some of them will leap to their feet just out of ego. But I do want to acknowledge some of them that have had a particularly impactful experience with me. Among them are Marjorie Hickey, Ron Creighton, Joel Pink, Phil Starr, Gail Rotherham-Chernin, Ray Larkin, Ron MacDonald, Catherine Walker, Robbie McKeegan, who's here and gave you a report earlier, and dating way back, but a good friend of mine, Bruce McIntosh, who's here today as well. When I go through that list, you can see why the society has been well served over the years. Those are some pretty stellar names, some pretty impactful people who provided excellent leadership. In the coming year, Dan has talked about some of the things that we're going to be dealing with on Counsel, but I want to refer to Counsel as your counsel. This is an organization that is chosen by, if you will, and is led by members of the profession. I'm one of them, but only one. And so your council has a lot on its plate this year, a lot of significant challenges, but it's going to rise to those. It has in the past, and it always will. But I want to talk about briefly 3 things that I want to focus myself on this year on your behalf and through your council. The first Dan talked about, and it's a longer-term vision, but it's one that I think we need to engage in now, and that's a discussion of how the profession is going to change. Not will it, but is going to change. Anybody who's followed any of the information coming out of the UK and Australia, you know that in those, particularly the UK and those jurisdictions, the practice of law has changed fundamentally, the way in which it's governed, the way in which it operates. There are private investors, equity investors in law firms. There are what are called alternate business structures, partnerships available now with non-lawyers, all sorts of ways in which the government of the United Kingdom has taken over self-governance and has decided that the consumer interest is paramount, to allow different ways for legal services to be delivered to the public that are cost-effective and effective for them. It is a laboratory. It is an experiment. I suspect the majority of the ABS or alternate business structures will not be successful. But at the end of the day, my view is that sooner or later, that perspective is going to arrive here in Nova Scotia and in Canada. And so I would, to make the analogy to a tsunami, I'd rather be on the surfboard on the leading edge of it than in the boat underneath it. And that literally, from my perspective, is what happened in the UK. The self-regulator took their eye off the ball and got run over. Now, this isn't something to fear, and in fact, it's not about to happen anytime soon, in my view. Our government has not indicated an appetite to do that. But it'll be an important conversation that we're going to begin with our council this year, your council, and you're going to hear from me about as I travel around the province, and that is to begin to think about how we can get ahead of the tsunami of change in self-regulation, change in business structures, and particularly the change in the ways in which legal services are going to be delivered in the future. It is simply coming. It's a question of who is going to control that process, who's going to have a voice in it, and how is it going to turn out in the end. Now, my view is, although I'm a solo practitioner from a little town in northern Nova Scotia, it actually, to me, is a very exciting prospect. It gives me the opportunity to think creatively as an entrepreneur, and it gives all of us an opportunity to think creatively as lawyers and as business people. So engage in the conversation when the opportunity arises, read as much as you can about it, and become familiar, because I think in the end, whether it's in the next 2 years, 10 years, or 20 years, we will do a service to ourselves and our successors, the youngsters coming up, to have that conversation now and get ahead of the wave. The second issue of focus for me is what I categorize generally as rural and small practice issues, because I'm both of them. It's very selfish of me to focus on those, but I'm gonna anyway. For those of us in small towns and in small practices, we know that as the population ages and as lawyers generally age and approach the area of retirement, I would never say we're going to retire. I don't know any lawyer who really does. They say they do, and then they show up at the office and you can't get rid of them. They call them counsel. But as we get older and as we get more challenged to determine what's next, for small practitioners, I'll give you an example. Down in Antigonish County, I had a conversation with a very old friend of mine who describes literally having a barn full of files. Now, I assumed that was a bit of a hyperbole, a bit of an exaggeration, until he showed me a barn full of files. So what to do? What are we to tell him as the regulator about how he can go about an orderly transition to retirement? After all, we know there's no limitation period effectively on negligence, issue number one. Issue number two, what about the regulations around file retention and succession planning? Issue number two. Issue number three, I don't know much about this because I'm not a real estate lawyer, but I know you have to retain your foundation documents, whatever they are, ad infinitum, until you, your children, and your grandchildren expire. So what do we tell our practitioners about that? In a larger firm, you will know that that is largely taken care of institutionally. But in a small firm and a solo practice, it just isn't. So we have to try to provide guidance and assistance to lawyers. Now, I'll tell you this, we don't decide most of this. For example, limitation period issues, that's a government responsibility. But you need to know your counsel is working actively with the government to pursue changes to the Limitation of Actions Act. The government's presented them and will continue to press them to make them so that there's some sort of a finite date at which you can rely on that your limitation or liability will end. Now, we're not there. We don't know how long it'll take to get there. Anybody who's dealt with government can understand the analogy of a glacier. But we will continue to work on that. We're going to work on the notion of what kind of guidance we can give you about all of these issues. And finally, we're doing work around the notion of, to be blunt, how do we renew in the rural areas the practice of law? Many of us are, I go to court, but for my QC, I would still be sitting in a chambers date in Pictou for a good 2 hours because despite the fact I'm practicing 20 years, I'm still middle of the road in terms of seniority at that counsel desk, which tells all of us we're getting older. And so in rural areas, the renewal is a tough subject. How do we attract lawyers? I think we should make a note about the air miles suggestion that Glenn had earlier, but short of that, we have a challenge. But you need to know that your council, your society, and I are working on that in the coming year and the coming years to try to find some solutions, but they're not easy. We would welcome any suggestions you have, and the working group on rural practice, headed by Carol Gillies of Antigonish, is actively engaged in that discussion now. The final comments I want to make are about LAP, Lawyers Assistance Program. For those of you who will invite me to speak to your organizations, your firms, your regional groups, I'm going to bring this message, and I'm going to start it here. Lawyers Assistance Program is an extremely valuable service that I think is underutilized by our members and our staff. I won't go into all the details of it, but I will tell you this. About 15 years ago, I fell into a depression. I was close to suicide. I was about to take some steps that my family would have regretted forever. Somebody suggested that I call LAP. And at that time, it wasn't the organization that we now engage to conduct that service. It was a one-person operation. But that service literally saved my life. Because I wouldn't have known nor had the guts to call my family practitioner or a psychologist I might know. But I was prepared to call a confidential 1-800 number to reach out and find out what could be done to help me. And so LAP is a service available to you, your family, your staff, and their family that can provide tremendous range of services at no cost. Now, in the case of me or someone like me, that's the emergency kind of intervention triage service and can provide counseling and immediate intervention in those circumstances. But LAP provides a wide range of services. Health and weight loss advice. I'll be making a call next week. I really wish you hadn't laughed at that, but fine. It provides services for young families who need assistance with advice on childcare and child rearing. If you have seniors in your life, your parents, your grandparents who need to transition in their lives, it'll provide assistance in that regard. So what I'm saying to you is that it provides a tremendous service to you, your families, your staff, and their families. And I think it's time that we begin to look around the room and around our communities, because I can tell you that based on the statistics, there are a lot of lawyers who are struggling. Based on the complaints that we receive through the professional responsibility process, there are a lot of lawyers struggling. And so what I would ask you to do is look at yourself and look at your friends, your colleagues, your staff, your family, and if you think somebody needs help, reach out to them or call and ask us to help. Because the LAP is there to support you, but if you don't make the call, if you don't make the contact, there's not much we can do. What we don't want to have happen is that the train wreck arrives at the door of professional responsibility. I'd much prefer to keep Humpty Dumpty intact than to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And the LAP is a wonderful tool. So I'll leave you with that thought. I also want to thank one other person who has been a tremendous support to me. She's not here today, probably because she's with her family. Her mother and sister is my wife, Elizabeth. She has stuck with me through this. I have no idea why, but she has been a tremendous support. And it's worth reminding ourselves that when we take on these roles, bad enough to be lawyers in the hours we put in, but when we step forward and take on these kinds of roles, it's tough on our families, tougher than on us. So I do want to thank her, albeit she's not here today. So with those thoughts, I look forward to an exciting year, to a productive year, and a year where we intend to serve the membership, the society, with all of our efforts. And I'd welcome any of you to contact me or members of your council at any time to discuss issues of concern. We may not have all the answers, but you can be assured we're going to work to find them if we can. Thank you very much.